this video I thought I'd talk about a couple of easier items to make for my Kawasaki Z900 Súper Six. So I'm going to make the Sprocket cover where I have to modify it to make it wider, and I'm going to make the starter motor extension cover from stainless steel. I'll show you some of the techniques and methods I use.
The first thing I have to do to the sprocket cover is clean off the oxidation and tarnishing using wet and dry paper and water out in the garden. In the bright sunshine during lockdown, it's a perfect thing to do. Once the sprocket cover was all clean, I went out in my shed, found a little sheet of aluminium to cut out a piece that I'm going to weld onto the sprocket cover to extend it by about 2 inches. So I cut out a rough rectangle at this stage because I'll be taking it back into the garage, bending it and then welding it to the cover. Back in the garage, I got my little bit of plate that I just cut out, offered it up to the engine to see that it was big enough. As you can see, it's straight, it needs to be curved, and it also needs to be contoured to fit the side of the engine. To put the curve in the sheet of aluminium, I gripped it in my vise and just pulled it by hand. It's quite stiff, but I managed to do it. The next thing I did was make a cardboard template of the sprocket cover to get the profile that I can transfer to the sheet of aluminium that I cut out. Then, using a marker pen, I scribed the line. Back in the shed, I used my bandsaw to cut out the piece, following the line I described earlier. With the piece trimmed to size, I clamped it to the actual engine casing using a piece of square steel and 2 clamps, then TIG welded, I actually tacked it in place with a couple of TIG welds on the engine with it all bolted up, and then transferred it to my vise to complete the weld. Once the welding was complete, I transferred the sprocket cover back onto the engine and did up the 4 screws tight. Then, using my hammer, I gently teased the edge around so it matched the profile of the crankcases. Once this was done, I offered up the starter motor cover to check the profile, and there at the edge you can see a gap which I need to fill with some weld and then shape afterwards using a file. Before I filled in the gap with weld, I decided I would actually file up the previous weld and smooth that all down, because if you leave it all to the end it can be a bit laborious filing all the welds down at once. It's nice to sort of spread it out. So I used some Abranet cloth, which is amazing like sandpaper. It just doesn't clog, you can use it for ages. You use that by hand to sort of blend in the surface and make it nice and smooth. It's just a first stage at 120 grit. Then offer the cover back up, put the starter cover back on again, just have a quick look before I do that last weld in there. After building up the edge with weld, I used my very coarse file to shape and profile the edge to match the gap that I had before. By memory and eye really, but you just keep filing until it looks about right. Then you can offer the engine casing back up and have a look. After a bit of filing, it was time to offer the casing back up to check for the fit. I first fitted the 4 screws to make sure it's held back tight in place, and once they were tight, I fitted the starter motor cover back on loosely to have a look at the gap, and I was pleased that everything looked fine and it's how I wanted it. Then, back out in the garden in the bright sunshine to do some cleaning up to the next stage. So I have to use wet and dry paper, 320 grade, rub it all down, all over, then go down to 400, 600, and end up with 1000 before I can go back in my shed to give it a good old buff on my buffer. With the polishing complete, it was time to go back in the garage and assemble the sprocket cover with all its parts, the clutch operating mechanism, the sound deadening mechanism, and the gasket and cover. The first thing to go into the sprocket casing is the clutch operating mechanism. It's held in place with 2 screws. Once the screws are tight, the next thing I fitted was the sound deadening material and its metal gauze cover. This is held in with 5 screws. The next thing I did was fit 2 new seals for the gear shaft. It's strange on the Kawasaki Z900 because it has a seal on both sides, so it's important to put some grease in between them to keep it lubricated. That's the first one in. Now we turn it over and repeat on this side with another seal, gently tapping in square. Then, using a bit of ZX1 extra lube grease and a screwdriver, I put some grease between the 2 seals just to lubricate the shaft. With the sprocket cover assembled, it's time to fit it to the engine, carefully engaging the gear change shaft through the new seals and doing up the 4 screws tight. Then, using a flat blade screwdriver and a 12mm socket, I set the clearance on the clutch push rod. So it's just got a little bit of a wiggle when it's tight, and that's all done ready. Then a new gasket, the polished cover, and 2 new screws completes that side. With the starter motor cover fitted, it's time to make the extending cover at the back, which I'm going to make out of 1.5mm thick stainless steel, using these 2 pillars in the centre to hold it on with 2 screws. So the first thing I need to do is get a piece of cardboard and make a template by inserting it underneath the starter motor cover, drawing round the profile at the end of the starter motor cover, then rubbing around with my finger to make an impression on the card, which is going to be the profile of the engine casing. From this, I can transfer that size across to a piece of stainless steel, cut it out with my tin snips. With the cardboard template cut out, I place it on my stainless steel sheet and draw around the edge with my marker pen. Then, using my tin snips, cut out the shape. With the part cut out, I take it out into the garden, into the sunshine, to use my angle grinder with a flapper wheel to profile the edges and clean it up and deburr it. With the edges deburred, I just check that it fits the starter motor cover, which it does nicely. So I then go back in the garage, fit the starter motor cover back on, offer up the cover, so make sure that it fits nice, which it does. Now the edges are overhanging a little bit, because I'll be turning those over shortly and drilling 2 holes in the centre. The first thing I need to do is bend a 90-degree angle on one of the sides of my cover plate. To do this, I grip it tightly in the vise, pull it over by hand, and then finish it off with a hammer. After a quick check, I returned it to the vise and completed the bend to make sure it was 90 degrees. With the first bend complete, I offered it up to the engine and it slid lovely in place and engaged perfectly with the starter motor cover. I then used a steel rule and a marker pen to mark a line for the next bend. I then placed the cover back in the vise to complete the second bend. First checking that the scribed line was exactly in line with the vise jaws, so I get a nice crease and a nice bend. With the second edge bent over, the cover slid nicely onto the engine engaged with the starter motor cover. A quick mark with a pen initiates where I have to cut with the hacksaw, so that the cover will miss the back of the engine casing. Then using my tin snips to cut out the little tiny segment. With the section cut out, the cover will now slide in place and engage down tight onto the crankcases. So my next job is to bend over the last bend. This can be quite tricky because it has to engage nicely with the starter motor and also nicely with the engine. So I used a block of aluminium that fits nicely between the other two bends to hold it in my vise to allow me to bend over the third bend using my hammer. With the third bend complete, I removed it from the vise to have a look, and it all looks great. But the corners need to be radiused, and at the moment they're not radiused. But this is quite easy to do. The cover fits nicely and engages on all three sides, but as you can see the corners look horrible, or I need to do something with that. But that's very easy to do using a socket that's the correct radius. That you need to just rest it on top and check, and if it's the correct radius we can use that to form the corners. To make the corners nice and radiused, I place the socket in the corner, grip it tight in the vise, and using my hammer just bend the metal over. Keep going until you get a nice radius. And there you go. Pull the socket out and we've got a lovely radius, but the metal sticks down quite a lot on the underside which needs trimming off, but that's very easy to do with my tin snips. A quick try on the engine and it fits lovely, and the curve is absolutely perfect. So now at the right at the back is a wire comes out from the oil pressure switch, so I need to file half a hole to match the half hole in the engine. So I just mark that with a pen, take it across to my vise and file it out with a round file. With the half hole filed, it's time to mark out the two central holes for the screws to hold the cover plate on. To do this, I placed two M5 countersunk screws into the M6 threads they just dropped in. Then, using a bit of paint, drop a bit of paint on top of each screw, then put the cover on, press down. When you lift it off, you've got two dots. Using a centre punch, find the centre of the paint, give it a tap, do the second one, and it's all ready for drilling. Now drilling, I use these special drills for sheet metal. They're absolutely brilliant because they start off small and they gradually get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you stop at the size that you want. But the main thing is they don't grab and they don't throw the job around everywhere. If you use an ordinary drill on sheet metal, it just grabs and shoots through too quick. This is just a nice way of doing that. With the holes drilled, I trial fitted the cover back onto the engine and the screws went in lovely. With the cover finished, it was time to go back out into the garden in the bright afternoon sunshine and do some polishing. But before I can buff the stainless steel on my buffer, I need to rub it up with some 320, 400, 600 and 1000 grade wet and dry paper. With that done, straight back into my shed onto my old buffer and give it a good shine. With the cover polished, I returned to the garage and fitted it to the engine. Then gave it a quick wipe over to remove my greasy fingerprints so I could stand back and admire it. I was really pleased how it's turned out. The last job to do on my Kawasaki Súper Six is to build up the bodywork and the petrol tank by fitting the cap, the tap, the badges and the rubber grommets so it can be fitted onto the bike. The very first thing I do to the petrol tank is make sure the top spout has been cleaned of all paint, as it's absolutely essential to prevent ethanol in the petrol eating under the lacquer and lifting it off. And if it's left unchecked, it can go right across the petrol tank in a few days, destroying the paint. So I make sure it's really smooth and back to bare metal. I'm fitting a pattern aftermarket petrol cap because the original was badly oxidised and sometimes it's not easy to get them re-chromed to an acceptable standard. These are very easy to fit if you do some basic precautions to protect the paint on the tank, and the pin is a very tight fit into the cap and it pivots in a hole in the tank. Now sometimes there's a bit of paint left over, so I use a drill in a tap holder, gently twist by hand to remove any paint that's in the hole. This will allow the pin to slide in nicely when you offer up the cap. The next thing to do is tap the pin into the cap so that it's flush with the inner opening. To do this, I use a little hammer, holding it in my hand, gently tapping it in until it's flush with the inside. And to check whether it's flush, I use a little stick, a little scriber, and just go backwards and forwards over the pin. You can feel if it's sticking through too much. If it sticks through too much, you won't get it on the tank. Before I start putting it on the tank, I actually put some old gasket paper and stick it on with masking tape so that the hammer won't hit the tank by accident. And then put the cap up to the little protrusion, line it up with a little pointer, put that in a slightly smaller diameter to locate the centre of the hole, and then using the hammer I slide it across the paper so there's no chance of denting the tank, hitting the pivot gently until it's engaged. Once it's engaged, I then use my little punch and the hammer to tap it all the way home flush. With the pivot pin tapped in flush, I just check that the cap operates okay. It hinges backwards and forwards nicely, so I remove the gasket paper and check with the key that it locks, and it locks great. So that's that done. The next job is to fit the badges to the side of the tank. Now these pattern badges, they come straight and you have to bend them into a curve. Now some of them are brittle, some of them are soft, and they're very hard to bend by hand without potentially snapping them. So the easiest way to do it is to get a bit of steel bar, bend it in the vise into a radius that sort of matches the tank, just by eye, it's good enough. When you're happy with that, you put that back in the vise and do it up really tight and use that as a former to bend the badges. So here's a badge going on, so I hold it with my thumb and you gently tease it down. Don't be tempted to do it all in one go, just gently tease it down, turn it around, do it both ways, keep pushing down until you're happy it looks right. And when you offer it up to the tank, it's supposed to touch nicely all the way around, which this did. So when you're really happy it's good, get the screws one at a time, engage with the thread, And be careful not to scratch the tank. If the badge drops down, it could scratch the tank. Then put in a second screw, job done. And obviously repeat that for the other side. The rear fin is a standard assembly, so all I had to do was put in some grommets and some steel spacers. They just literally slip straight in. The grommets are made in two pieces with some tapered washers. So you pop it up from underneath, and you put the top rubber washer on around the correct way till it snaps down, and then push the little bit of tube in the centre. And you do this 4 times to complete the fin. The side panels needed a little bit of work before they were painted. They had originally 2 holes in for the badge, and I would need 3 for my Z1B badges that I'm going to be fitting. So what I used was a product called Bond. It's amazing stuff. It's a 2-stage glue. So you've got powder that you sprinkle in the hole, move it off flush with your thumb, and you drop in the adhesive and it sets instantaneously. So the first thing to do is put a bit of masking tape over the back or the front, doesn't matter. Pour the powder in, then use your finger just to get rid of the excess so it's flush. And very careful with the adhesive because it sticks your fingers together as well, obviously. 2 drips or 1 drip on each one. And you can see it wick down into the powder and set instantly. And you peel off the paper and it's nice and smooth. So when I take that to Neil now, he can sand that all back and paint that, and you can't tell. So when I get my panels back, they're all smooth, ready for drilling. So the Bond adhesive comes in a little bottle for the black powder, and you get grey powder as well, and you get the adhesive here, and you get a little box for about £10. It's very good. Now here's the panel. Now I've already drilled and fitted this side panel on the bike to get it where I wanted it, and to make it match exactly on the other side panel, I use this method where I line the panels up by eye from above, looking down to get them in the same position, and you put masking tape at 90 degrees to the base of the panel, stick it on both sides of the badge at the right width, all by eye, and then that'll give you the width. And then what you do then, you put another bit of masking tape across at the bottom of the bottom of the badge. Then you put another piece at the bottom of the actual side panel, like that. And you put another piece at the top or the bottom of the other side panel, but parallel with the first piece of tape. And then you just judge by eye, because it's ever so easy by eye, just judge it, and get the other piece the same gap to match the top one. And just to make sure, I check it with my caliper, and it's pretty much spot on first time, which is good. So then I put the badge, and I rest it on top, lining it up with the masking tape, and just double check that it looks right, which it does. So I get a bit of paint, put on each of the terminals. There's 3 terminals that stick through. It's always a good thing to make sure these terminals are straight first, otherwise you'll put the holes in the wrong place. And if they're slightly bent, just tease them straight with some pliers. Rest it on the panel, 3 dots, and you can start drilling. Now you have to be very careful with the drilling. You don't want it to wander. So I've got an electric drill that starts very slow and gradually speeds up, which is perfect. So I drill the first hole, offer up the badge to make sure it's in the right size, which it is. And I had a quick look to see that the legs lined up with the paint dots, which they did. Just double check, and then you can start drilling the other holes, because you've got one chance of getting this right. Although you can't see it behind the badge if you do make a slight mistake, but it's nice to get it right. So that's the 2 holes engaged nicely. And I just do the last hole, and then there's the badges fitting on nicely. The next thing to do is turn the panel over, put it on a piece of cloth so you don't damage the surface of the paint, to press on the little catches, the little washers with the serrated edges that prevent the badges from falling off. And I found the easiest way to do this is to use a little tiny socket on a push bar, so you can put the washer on with your hand, press it down nice and firm, and it holds the badge on really secure, and it's not going to fall off. And here it is, all fitted to the bike, out in the sunshine, waiting to be enjoyed. We can't ride it now, as you know, with the coronavirus issue we've got going on, but hopefully very soon I'll be out on a ride to give it a good old test. In this episode of How It's Made, I'm going to be talking about how I make my copper cylinder head gaskets for my Kawasaki Z900 Súper Six, and also my paper gaskets. I've been waiting for this parcel for several days. I hope it's the copper for my Z900 Súper Six gaskets. I took it out in the garden to open it just in case, and removed the copper. and yes, 1.2mm thick, 99% pure copper. I just wash my hands and I'm out in the garage to start making them. I'm going to make the copper gaskets in two pieces, with the left hand side and the right hand side, and the cam tunnel will have the standard O-ring. The first thing I have to do is to cut the copper sheet in half. So to do this, I first measure and mark a line in the centre. Then take it into my shed. In the shed, I'm going to use my bandsaw to cut the copper sheet in half. I wear ear defenders for this job because it can get very noisy. The trick is to go quite slow and not push too hard to keep a straight line. Back in the garage, I use a file to take off all the burrs from the sawing process. With all the burrs gone, I get the barrels and place them on my bench, then place the copper sheets on top, with the right hand side and the left hand side. Then I use some masking tape to fix the copper sheets to the top of the barrels and hold them tight. I then carefully turn over the barrels and rest them down onto the copper sheet on my bench. Using a scriber, I scribe around the bottom of the bore onto the copper sheet to make a line to cut to later. With all 6 bores marked, I turn the barrels back over and remove the copper sheets. And there you can see the 3 cylinders marked out on each side. Then, using a black pen, I mark the centres just by eye. I will be using these special sheet metal drills for drilling a hole in the centre of each marked cylinder. I need to make it 12mm diameter, so it starts off at 6, goes up to 8, up to 10, and I stop at 12. And the beauty of these drills, they don't grab or try and twist the metal while you're drilling. That's one side drilled, now for the other. With the 3 holes drilled in each piece, I will then be using my Qmax cutter to enlarge the hole to 52mm diameter. This is a Qmax cutter. These are designed for cutting holes in sheet metal. Normally you have a bolt through the centre and you clamp one piece each side, do the bolt up and it cuts the hole. When they get this big it can be very hard, so I decided to do it in my vise. With the first hole cut, I proceed to do the other 5. With the holes cut at 52mm using my Kumax cutter, the next job is to increase the size to 70mm using my curved internal tin snips. It's always best to trim off a little bit at a time, gradually increasing the size to the required size, otherwise you might find yourself cutting it too big and you can't put the metal back on. Well, that's the holes trimmed to 70mm. It's now time to try them over the barrel and see how it looks. And they look great. I'm really pleased with that. So the next thing is to clean them up a little bit with a file, just to take off all the sharp edges from using the tin snips. After I finish filing all 6 bores, I use my Dremel with a sanding disc to smooth down the surface and make it all smooth and shiny. With the polishing complete, I place the 2 copper gaskets back on top of the cylinder block and get ready to mark out the periphery and drill all the holes where the studs are going to go. An easy way to mark out a gasket is to use sticky back plastic, or you can buy it in a roll really cheaply on eBay. First, cut out a piece of sticky back plastic roughly to the size that you want to use. So in this case I just cut it in half and it was perfect, one for each side. Just checking it fits. Then peel off the backing and stick it onto the cylinder block, pressing down firmly. Next, I need to cut out the holes where the cylinder bores are. So I rub around with my finger first so I can see where they are. Then, using a sharp knife, cut out the holes. You lean the blade on the edge of the bore as you go around, then you produce a nice circle. Using a soft instrument like a back of a ballpoint pen or a marker pen to press around the holes, but don't punch through, just to press down to make it visible, because you're going to be cutting these out with a sharp knife shortly. Now trim out the holes using a sharp knife. Rest it against the edge of the hole and just rotate it round and it'll form a perfect circle, which will be used as a guide for drilling the holes in the copper at a later stage. With the holes cut, you can use a sharp blade to follow the edge of the cylinder barrel, removing the excess material to form a perfect template to make the new gasket. With the sticky back plastic template cut out, gently peel it off, being careful not to stretch it or tear it. Then place it onto the copper, lining up the bores. When you're happy it's lined up, press down tight. Then repeat for the other side. Back in the shed, I used my bandsaw to cut out the gasket, following closely the edge of the sticky back plastic template. When using the bandsaw, it's important to let the blade cut through the sheet. Don't try and force it through, and keep an eye on the edge when you're doing your cut to make sure you follow the right shape. It can take a while, but the end result will be worth it. With both the gaskets cut out, I go back to the garage to mark out the holes. Using a centre punch, mark the centre of each hole. Now, using my sheet metal drill, I drill the holes where the studs are going to pass through, stopping at the 12mm cutting size. With the drilling complete, I'll remove the template. Then I use a file to clean up the edges and remove all the burrs. Then, using some abranet cloth, I go along my filed surface to remove any burrs from the edges. To finish off, I use my Dremel with a sanding disc. This produces a really nice shine and a really smooth surface. Finally, I stamp the gasket left and right so I can't get them mixed up in the future. And here's the finished gaskets resting on top of the cylinder block, and I'm really pleased with them. They look great. But the next job is to anneal them, so I go out to the utility room and run a couple of inches of water in the sink. Then, using my MAP gas blowtorch, I heat them up until they're glowing red hot and drop them in the water to quench. Dropping the red hot copper in water makes it go soft and malleable. With both gaskets quenched, I go back in the garage and finally dry them on my cylinder block, and they look great. So that's how I make copper gaskets. Next, I'm going to show you how I make my paper gaskets, but first I'm going to use my 35-year-old Dyson to clean up all the mess and the bits of sharp swarf. To make my paper gaskets, I use this oil-resistant gasket paper that you can buy online. And this roll is 0.8 of a millimetre thick, which is perfect for base gaskets. First thing I do is unroll and cut off a length suitable for the gasket to be made. I use my Swiss Army knife with a scissor attachment. I find it perfect for cutting out gaskets. Then, turn the barrel upside down so the liners are protruding and place the gasket paper on top, pressing down firmly with my thumb and my fingers to outline the barrel liners. It's important that the gasket paper doesn't move at this stage or it will give a false impression. When I'm happy that I've made an imprint of the 6 liners, I turn it over to check and I can see 6 round marks. These will now be cut out using my Swiss Army knife scissors. And there we go, 6 holes. So now I check that they fit on the barrels. There'll be a nice tight fit if you cut directly to the line. Now, using my thumb and fingers, I press down hard, following the periphery of the barrel, so that the edge makes a sharp impression onto the gasket paper. Also pressing down tightly over the holes with my thumbs and fingers to make an indent that can be cut out later. And here is the impression to be cut. Before I cut out the gasket, I use my hole punch to punch the holes where the studs are going to pass through. With the holes punched, I just thought I'd try it onto the engine because there's a lot of studs and it slips on lovely. I'm well pleased with that. The last job to do is to cut out the shape with my Swiss Army knife. This can take quite a while, but it makes a lovely result when it's finished. With the gasket cut out, it's now time to try it onto the cylinder block. And I'm really pleased when it fits straight on, like a glove. With the head gasket and base gaskets complete, the last thing I have to do is order the seal that fits in the groove by the cam tunnel. I hope you enjoy my videos on what I get up to in my garage, and if you'd like to see more, don't forget to subscribe. I'll be uploading some new videos very soon. In this video, I'm going to explain how I converted the barrels from a 4-cylinder Kawasaki Z900 into 6-cylinder to fit my new Súper Six engine. It's going to be 1522cc. The first thing I have to do is to decide which sets of barrels I'm going to use for the inner cylinders and which sets I'm going to use for the outer cylinders. Now this depends entirely on the condition of the fins. I like to choose the best barrel for the outer fins, so I'm going to choose this one here that's only got one broken fin. And this one here that's got various broken fins, I'll use for the inner cylinders. So the outer cylinders get cut down the centre, so I've got a pair of cylinders each side. And this set will be cut there, and I'll just use the centre portion. Before I can start cutting the barrels, I need to remove the liners, so I etch each liner to correspond with the bore it came out of, so I can replace them in the same place. Then, take the barrel outside and put it into my barbecue to warm up. I put the first set of barrels into the barbecue and shut the lid so they warms up to temperature. Once it's at a temperature, I remove that set of barrels, take it into the garage, replacing it with the other set of barrels to warm up while I'm pressing the liners out of the first set of barrels. Back in the garage, I put the barrels onto my press, set up a suitable size spacer and push the liners out. They come out very, very easily. They're only just gripping slightly, using hardly any force whatsoever. With the first liner out, I proceed to the next liner, positioning the aluminium spacer on top first, and then lowering the ram down, and that one just fell straight out. So there we go, all 4 liners are now out of the first set of barrels. So I return to the barbecue and notice the temperature's gone right up, and when I opened the door, the liners had literally just fallen out on their own. So obviously I didn't heat it up enough the first time. This is so much easier. And 3 of them just lifted straight out. And the 4th one was just a little tiny bit stuck. So I went into the garage and gave that little tap with an aluminium bar and it fell straight out. I thought I'd measure the temperature of the barrels just for reference for the future. 112 degrees. So I now know to heat them up to 112 degrees. With all the liners out, both barrels, I proceed to do the cutting through the first set through the cam chain tunnel. Sometimes the castings are a little bit hard due to silicon probably in the aluminium, so I add a bit of ZX1 oil. It makes a huge difference. With the first side of the cam tunnel cut, I reverse the barrels in the vise to cut the opposite side. With the first set of barrels cut in half, I place them on the bench and slide them up behind the other set of barrels so you can see how they're going to form when they're joined together. The rear is the outer and the front will be the middle. So before I start cutting the front, I scribe 2 nice lines and then I'm going to go out to my bandsaw because it's so much easier than using the hacksaw. In the shed, I adjust my bandsaw so that the barrels will pass underneath and allow me to cut to the scribed lines that I'd scratched earlier. It's a slow process, but you have to persevere. I give the bandsaw blade a quick spray of ZX1. It helps the cutting. Well, that's both the end bits cut off. And the funny thing is I stuck them together and it looks like a weird engine with a funny shaped piston, but that can go in the spares part. Always good to keep the bits for fins, for repairing fins. And there's the centre portion that's cut out. So now I offer up the 2 outer portions to get a rough idea of where I've got to machine it down to get the right width. The first thing I do is set up the centre portion of my milling machine using the horizontal cutter to mill the end surfaces true and flat. This can take quite a while. You can't take a very big cut because the fins could snap off, so it's just gentle as you go. With all the surfaces machined flat on all three components, I line it up on the bench with a rule to scribe the fins so I can start trimming the fins to size. Then, using my hacksaw, I cut the edges off that I don't need to trim it to size. With the excess fins cut off, I use my coarse file to file them down to the line and to make them look smooth and nice. With the first side filed down nice, I start cutting the other side off to remove the excess fins. And once this is cut off, I then have to file them down flat and then repeat this on the other casting as well. It takes a while, but the end result is worth it. With all the fins filed to size, I now concentrate on the top surface, where bits of the old casting are sticking out and are proud. So I mark these off with my marker pen, and then file them down with my coarse file until it's smooth with the existing fins. With the top surface is complete, I now concentrate on that broken fin from earlier on. So the first thing you do is use a stainless steel wire brush and give it a good rub to remove any oxidation and paint and bits of mess. Then with my TIG welder, you build up a weld starting at the bottom and gradually working way up to the top, not worrying about how big it is because you can always file it down. Well, here's the finished weld where the fin was broken, and here's the fin once it's been filed. Then had the barrels media blasted so they're all clean, ready for welding. And before I could weld them, I had to bolt them onto the crankcases of my engine to hold them in the right place. Then I put all the liners upside down in the recess on the barrels, and using a rule, I made sure they're all in line and the barrels were sitting flat on the crankcases. When I was happy, I removed all the liners and tightened up the head bolts tight. With the liners removed, I double checked that the head was still flat, and it was, perfectly in line. So I got my 17mm spanner and tightened the studs down to hold the 3 bits of barrel in place tight on the crankcases, ready for welding. With all the bolts tight, I switched on my TIG welder and connected the earth strap to the barrels. With the welded joints complete along the top of the barrels and down the fins where I could reach, I removed the barrels from the engine so I could file flat the welds. I transferred the barrels to my milling machine table and bolted them down secure on the nice flat surface, then proceeded to file very carefully the top surface flat, just removing the weld raised area. I now had to remove some tiny bits of weld on the surfaces of the recess where the liners go. So I used my Dremel with a carbide burr, very carefully remove weld from the side only, being careful not to touch the flat face at the bottom of the recess. A quick check with the liners to make sure they fit, and they fitted lovely. So that's that done. I can blow off with an airline to remove all the dust, and I can take the barrels off, turn them upside down, and bolt them back down again onto my milling machine, and weld the bottom side joints. With the barrels clamped upside down in place on the milling machine, I get out the TIG welder and weld all the joints that I can get to across the bottom face and down the fins. I then smooth down the 2 sets of welds with my coarse file until it's flush. Then I remove the barrels from the milling machine and use my Dremel with carbide burrs to file down the little welds between the fins. With all the welds ground down, I now use little sanding discs on the Dremel to polish the welds, getting in between the fins the best I can. With all the fin welds polished and the top and bottom surfaces flat, it's time to replace the liners into their original holes in the bore. So to do that, I first put the barrel in my barbecue to warm it up. With the barrels nice and warm, I return it to my hydraulic press and start pressing in the liners. They take no effort and slide straight in. I check with my thumb that it's flush, which it is, then I proceed to the next liner. With all the liners pressed in, the next thing to do is to trial fit it on the engine and see that it fits. This is the first trial fit of the barrels, just to check that the liners fit down in all the stubs, because these are the bigger 1015cc liners. They're slightly larger than the Z1 liners, but they fitted lovely and look great. The next thing I need to do is hone the cylinders, because these are original bores and I just need to take the glaze off so the new rings will seat in nicely. And to do that, I'm going to use my 4-stone hone and my electric drill. Before I can hone the cylinders, I need to put a bit of white spirit in each bore. This acts as a lubricant and helps the stones cut rather than skidding over the surface. With the drill running on its slowest setting, I traverse the hone in and out of the cylinder bore to give a nice cross-hatched finish. I then repeat the honing process for the other 5 cylinders in turn until they're all nice and smooth with a cross-hatched finish. With the cylinder honing complete, I give the bores a quick wipe round with some cloth soaked in white spirit, just to clean off any bits. I then place the 6 pistons in the barbecue just to warm up a little bit to allow the gudgeon pins to slide in easily. While they're warming up, I put a bit of oil on each little end bearing, just to help the gudgeon pins slide through. With the pistons all warm from the barbecue, the gudgeon pins slide in easily. I'm fitting them to the engine temporarily just to check that the barrels will fit. I won't be fitting rings at this stage. With all the pistons fitted, I go across the bench and get the barrels and offer up the 2 central pistons first, engaging the bores, and gently lowering down on the other 2 pistons, and then finally the outside pistons until the barrel drops down firmly onto its seat. I rotate the crankshaft by hand and the pistons go up and down perfectly. So that's the barrels finished. I'm really pleased how they've turned out. I get quite a lot of requests on Facebook and social media